Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're tackling a story that I think for a lot of people really just exists in the realm of, holiday sentiment. The Christmas Truce of 1914. You hear that, and you probably picture soldiers singing carols, maybe a game of football.
The postcard version of the event.
Exactly.
Okay.
But that sentimental image, and it is rooted in some fact, it also obscures a far more complex, I'd say darker and historically crucial truth.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's arguably the single most paradoxical event in the history of modern warfare.
It's a big statement.
Well, think about it. This huge, unauthorized stop in the fighting happens only 5 months into a war that was already defining itself by just industrial-scale slaughter.
Right.
So it didn't just challenge military discipline, it challenged the very idea of, the innate, unforgiving hatred that the whole war machine needed to function.
And that's really the core of what we want to do in this deep dive. We want to go beyond the stories of, soldiers exchanging plum puddings. Our mission is to really synthesize the primary sources, the letters, the diaries, and also the analytical frameworks that historians use.
Yeah, to really understand the why behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To understand why the Christmas truce wasn't just this spontaneous burst of goodwill, but what a lot of scholars now call a rational survivalist response.
A response to just utterly impossible conditions, both strategic and environmental.
So we need to see it through the soldiers' eyes, not the sentimentalists.
Precisely. We need to look at the geography, the sociology that made this fraternization even possible, how it was executed down to the forensic details of what they traded, how they buried their dead.
And critically, why the high command was so terrified by it and crushed it so fiercely.
This deep dive is about that moment where, for a short time, human rational choice just superseded state-enforced dogma.
Okay, so let's unpack all of that. To understand the truce, we have to start with the strategic context. How did we get from this expectation a quick, glorious war in August 1914?
To soldiers shaking hands in a frozen, muddy ditch just 5 months later? Well, the initial expectation, on all sides, was based entirely on mobility.
The war of movement.
The war of movement. The entire military doctrine in Europe, especially Germany's Schlieffen Plan, was built on the idea of a swift, mobile fight.
A knockout blow.
A knockout blow, a rapid sweep through Belgium into France and achieve victory before Christmas. Everybody thought this.
Home by Christmas.
It was the common belief on both sides. A brief, decisive conflict.
And that illusion was, to put it mildly, shattered almost immediately.
Brutally so. I mean, after the German advance was finally blunted at the First Battle of the Marne, the armies didn't retreat and reform like in older wars.
No, they started digging.
Well, first they started running. It was called the Race to the Sea.
Right.
Both sides were desperately trying to outflank the other, just pushing northward and northward toward the English Channel, looking for that open flank, that one last chance for a breakthrough.
But neither side could find one.
No. The entire effort failed. And what it led to instead was this continuous, fortified front line that stretched for 475 miles.
All the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea.
And just like that, the war of movement was dead. It had completely ossified into this strategic quagmire we now call the Western Front.
And that new geographical reality must have created a massive psychological vacuum for the troops.
Oh, absolutely. The promise of being over by Christmas was evaporating right as Christmas was literally arriving.
And this wasn't just a strategic disappointment. It was the sheer scale of the combat, right?
The industrial scale of it. I mean, just look at the First Battle of Ypres. It wrapped up only a few weeks before the truce in November 1914.
And the casualties were staggering.
Nearly 60,000 casualties for the British Expeditionary Force alone, the BEF.
60,000. It's hard to even comprehend that number.
And it wasn't just a number. That loss basically wiped out the core of Britain's professional pre-war army.
So the men who were left in the trenches by December were not the same optimistic soldiers who'd marched off in August.
Not at all. They weren't fresh-faced volunteers. They were survivors, battered, exhausted, and just grappling with the deep psychological shock of a war that seemed endless, indecisive, and defined by a kind of industrialized slaughter they had never, ever trained for. Their whole concept of war was suddenly irrelevant.
This strategic failure leads us right to the physical preconditions for peace. You call it the geography of intimacy.
Yes.
If this were a war fought today with drones and long-range missiles, or even later in World War I with deeper trench systems, This truce couldn't have happened.
It's impossible. Technology and distance are perfect tools for dehumanization.
But in late 1914, that wasn't the case.
No. We tend to picture the trenches of 1917, these deep, concrete, complex networks. But in late 14, they were often just, as one soldier put it, scratches in the ground.
Hastily dug.
Very hastily dug. Shallow, no proper parapets, no complex support systems, just ditches, really.
And that lack of sophistication meant one critical thing. They were incredibly close to each other.
Crucially close. I mean, the average distance across the front might have been, say, 60 to 300 yards. But in the key sectors where the truce really took hold, places like Ploegsteert Wood or Armentières,
It was much closer.
much closer, the distance shrank dramatically.
How close are we talking about here?
In some places, as little as 30 to 40 yards between the front lines.
30 yards, that's nothing. That's insane.
It's easily within shouting distance. You could throw something, and most importantly, you could listen.
That's just an absurdly intimate setup.
Yeah.
It forces this kind of perverse cohabitation.
It does. This proximity created a constant sensory bleed-through. You could hear the enemy's conversations, you could smell their cooking fires, you could smell their tobacco.
You could see their daily routines.
You could see them struggling to pump water out of the trench, hear them cursing the mud, watch them trying to set up wire. Private Marmaduke Walkington wrote about shouting remarks across no man's land.
What kind of remarks?
Sometimes crude insults, of course, but often just jokes. Or comments about the terrible weather.
And that constant sensory input has to just fundamentally erode the abstract demonization, right? The propaganda posters back home.
Absolutely. When you can hear a man coughing through the cold night, or you can hear his distinct Saxon accent complaining about the mud just like you are,
He stops being the two-dimensional, bloodthirsty Hun.
he becomes a fellow soldier, a fellow victim of the same miserable environment.
And speaking of the environment, that was the final piece of the puzzle, wasn't it? The weather itself. That autumn had been famously brutal.
The misery before Christmas is almost impossible for us to imagine. The Flanders clay, this exceptionally wet autumn, it created a permanent quagmire.
It's just mud and water everywhere.
Trenches were constantly flooded, parapets would collapse, and the constant wet and cold led to these widespread debilitating conditions like trench foot.
So the elements were the great equalizer. They were the first shared enemy.
Yes, a solidarity of suffering. But then, just days before Christmas, something decisive happened. The weather changed. A sharp, sustained frost set in. And this wasn't just about it getting colder, it was transformative. It hardened the ground, it drained the water, it provided this temporary physical relief from the constant, perpetual wet misery.
And this shift, it also created a kind of atmospheric clarity.
That's a great way to put it. The cold, crisp air carries sound much further and with greater clarity than wet, damp air. Bruce Bairnsfather, the famous cartoonist who was there, he described this surreal, ethereal atmosphere.
So that meteorological change meant that when the singing started,
It carried with a shocking, clear resonance. It cemented that solidarity of suffering right before the first man stepped out of the trench.
so the truce didn't just appear out of nowhere on Christmas Eve. Our sources are really clear that it was more of an escalation of a system that was already in place.
Yes, the behavioral groundwork had already been laid.
Let's talk about that groundwork, the live and let live system.
This is absolutely crucial. If you don't understand live and let live, the Christmas truce looks like some kind of isolated miracle.
When in fact, it was the necessary precursor.
It was an escalation, as you said. It was a set of these tacit, informal agreements that govern daily life in the static sectors of the front.
And this is where the work of historian Tony Ashworth is so important. He frames this not as, spontaneous human goodness, but as cold survivalist logic.
Precisely. Ashworth's analysis is all about rational choice. And the logic was simple. In a static, indecisive sector, aggression was just self-defeating.
Right. If my sniper takes a pot shot at one of your guys,
I'm going to immediately retaliate. We'll both probably end up with casualties, and nobody will have gained a single inch of territory. It was pointless.
this is almost a kind of primitive game theory playing out in the trenches.
That's a perfect analogy. Mutual cooperation, not firing, results in the highest collective survival rate. Unilateral aggression just guarantees mutual defection, or return fire and a casualty spiral.
And the soldiers on both sides figure this out pretty quickly.
Very quickly, they recognize this zero-sum reality. If you don't shoot at me during breakfast, I won't shoot at you, and we both get to live another day. This led to these very specific, if informal, rules of engagement.
Tell me about these rules. How do they actually work day to day?
Well, for one, they established sanctuary times.
Sanctuary time.
Yeah. Troops learned to recognize the enemy's logistical routines, so they'd just refrain from firing during periods that were vital for survival.
Like when rations were being brought up to the line.
Exactly. Or during latrine breaks, or when men had to get out and do essential repair work on the parapets.
So they were basically giving short-term diplomatic immunity to the enemy's logistics.
That's a good way of putting it. And my favorite example of this, which just shows how sophisticated the communication was, is something called ritualized aggression.
Ritualized aggression, what's that?
Okay, so to keep high command happy and to maintain the appearance of being aggressive, which was, essential for the official war diaries.
They had to look like they were fighting.
Right. So artillery batteries would fire at the exact same time, at the exact same, often predetermined and non-threatening target every single day.
And the other side would quickly learn the schedule.
They'd learn the schedule. It was a signal. Look, we are fulfilling our duty by firing at 5 a.m. sharp at these coordinates. But since we're firing there, we're not actually trying to kill you.
Wow. So the soldiers were already conditioned to communicate non-aggression through these really specific, subtle behaviors. They were just waiting for a trigger to go from covert peace to open peace.
And that's where we get the great irony of the truce. The logistical triggers were provided by governments and private groups who were trying to boost fighting morale.
The Christmas gifts.
The Christmas gifts. They inadvertently facilitated the peace by flooding the lines with presents.
So this Christmas generosity literally became the currency of the truce.
It did. On the British side, you had the famous Princess Mary tin.
Oh, I've seen pictures of those. They're beautiful.
A beautiful brass box sent to every serving member of the imperial forces. And inside, you had these luxuries. Cigarettes, pipe tobacco, a pipe, a pencil, and a Christmas card from the princess.
So this surplus of tobacco, provided by the state to support the war, became the state-supplied currency of exchange.
Exactly. And the Germans were equally flooded with what they called Liebesgaben, love gifts. The Kaiser sent out meerschaum pipes and cigars. German families sent all sorts of comforts.
But you mentioned there was one specific, uniquely German gift that acted as the visual catalyst.
The Tannenbaum, the Christmas trees.
Of course.
Families, and in some cases even high command, sent thousands and thousands of these miniature fir trees to the front. And they were just these profound, unmistakable cultural symbols of Heiliger Abend, Holy Eve in the German tradition.
So the visual symbol of the German Christmas tree became the bridge.
Yes. For a British soldier looking across no man's land, the sight of a candlelit tree on a German parapet sent an unambiguous cultural message. Christmas is here. And with it comes a temporary sanctity that transcends this war. It was the visual trigger.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have a strategic stalemate, this insane geographical intimacy, shared misery, tacit agreements, and now cultural gifts. Christmas Eve, 1914. How does it actually start? Let's talk about the string of pearls.
As darkness fell on the 24th, the sheer strangeness began. British sentries started reporting something just utterly bizarre.
Movement on the German line.
Movement, followed by these little pinpricks of light appearing all along the German parapet. We have an account from Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment, who recorded his men carefully placing these little illuminated Christmas trees all along the edge of their trench.
And just the act of placing a light on the parapet, that's normally suicidal. It's a perfect target for a sniper.
That is the whole significance of it. The fact that thousands of these candles were lit and stayed lit, stretching across the line for miles without drawing fire from either side, that was the silent visual signal that the truce had begun.
Before a word was even spoken.
Before a word. To the British soldiers looking out across the darkness, it looked like a string of pearls draped across the horizon, signaling a guaranteed pause in the killing.
So once that visual signal is established, the silence of the guns is filled with music.
The auditory dialogue begins, and again, the Germans were the initiators.
They started singing.
They started singing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. And that melody in that cold, crisp, clear air, it just carried so easily.
I can't imagine how haunting and credible that must have sounded.
It must have been. And the British, they recognized the melody. After a moment of stunned silence, they started responding.
With their own carols.
Right. We have accounts from soldiers like Graham Williams of the London Rifle Brigade, who mentioned them singing back with things like "The First Noel" or "Oh, Come, All Ye Faithful."
And this leads to that moment that Williams describes as just truly extraordinary.
Yes, when the British finished singing, "O Come All Ye Faithful," the Germans immediately picked up the exact same tune.
But they sang it in Latin.
They sang the original Latin text, Adeste Fidelis.
Wow.
And Williams, just a typical Londoner, he wrote about the shock of it. Here are these men you're supposed to hate and kill, and they're sharing a hymn with you, singing in the same universal language of the church.
That's the pivotal moment, isn't it? That musical dialogue establishes a common cultural language, a shared Christian tradition that it supersedes the nationalist hatred.
They discovered a deeper identity that they shared, one that was more fundamental than the uniforms they were wearing.
And that provided the final psychological safety net they needed.
Exactly. They had successfully tested the silence, they established non-aggression through light, they confirmed a shared culture through song, and all of that paved the way for the ultimate step, getting out of the trenches on Christmas Day.
So Christmas morning. How does that transition happen from just shouting across the lines to actually meeting in no man's land?
It was often just initiated by individuals. A few brave souls standing up and waving, or a couple of men cautiously stepping out, usually with their hands up.
And once that was tested, and nobody got shot.
The officers quickly stepped in, not necessarily to stop it, because at that point they probably couldn't, but to control it, to formalize the interaction.
Was that a way for them to contain the sort of potentially mutinous nature of it all?
Oh, absolutely. An officer like Captain C.I. Stockwell of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers knew he couldn't just forbid it without risking a complete breakdown of discipline.
So he managed it instead.
He managed it. Stockwell described a formal negotiation with the German officer. They bowed, they exchanged salutes, they traded their currency cigarettes for cigars, and they agreed to the specific terms of the temporary peace for the day.
But most of the interaction wasn't that formal, was it? It was much more joyous.
In the British sectors, overwhelmingly so. We have that incredible letter from Captain Sir Edward Holse of the Scots Guards. He wrote home describing it, saying, "They greeted one another like the best of friends and shook hands. You would have thought the war was at an end."
And he also makes a really crucial point about who specifically the British were facing.
Yes, he notes that the Germans opposite his sector were friendly Saxons, and this regional distinction within the German army is vital for understanding why the truce was so widespread in the Anglo-German sectors. The British really did distinguish between the different German groups.
So once they're out in no man's land, the official death zone, this immediate dynamic little economy just springs up. Let's map out this barter economy.
It was transactional, but it was also highly symbolic, and it was all built on exchanging those state-supplied luxuries we talked about.
The standard currency was tobacco.
Without a doubt. British Princess Mary, tin cigarettes, and high-quality Navy-cut tobacco were immediately traded for German cigars and those meerschaum pipes from the Kaiser.
And what did the exchanges tell us about the logistical differences between the two armies?
You see really clear differences in the rations. The British had a lot of preserved goods like jam, tins of bully beef, and of course the legendary plum pudding.
A very symbolic Christmas treat.
Very. The Germans, on the other hand, had things like fresh sausages, loaves of their army bread, the Commis brought beer, and high-proof schnapps. The exchanges were a genuine, if fleeting, taste of the enemy's daily life.
But the most symbolic things they traded were parts of their identity, literally parts of their uniforms.
Yes, they were cutting buttons right off their tunics. They were trading belt buckles and cap badges. These were instant, visceral souvenirs of a unique moment in history.
And the German belt buckles were highly prized.
Very much so, because they had the motto, "Gott mit uns, God with us." Trading these items was like a statement, I met you, I survived this, and now I have a physical piece of your identity to prove it.
Some even exchanged addresses.
They did, exchanging mailing addresses, genuinely believing and hoping that they might meet again after the war.
That goes so far beyond just a handshake. That's an attempt to forge a post-war connection right in the middle of the war.
It's an act of profound hope, isn't it? And if you want the absolute ultimate example of the suspension of hostility, you have to look at the verifiable case of the barber of no man's land.
This story is just incredible. Lay it out for us. Who was Arno Bohm?
Arno Bohm was a German soldier, a Saxon with the 133rd Regiment. And the remarkable detail is that before the war, Bohm had been a professional barber in London.
So he was serving a civilian population that now considered him a mortal enemy.
Exactly. And during the truce, he basically set up shop right there in the middle of no man's land. A photograph exists, later verified by his family, showing him standing there, razor in hand, cutting the hair of a British soldier.
Just think about the psychological barrier that had to dissolve for that to happen.
It's the ultimate act of trust in what is supposed to be a zero-trust environment.
You are letting the enemy hold a razor to your throat.
A lethal weapon, perfectly capable of slitting your throat. But not for combat. For grooming. For a routine act of human service. It just completely transcends the soldier identity.
It shows that these men were neighbors and service providers before they were enemies.
It's proof that civilization hadn't been entirely eradicated by the trenches.
Okay, we have to address the most famous, enduring image of the truce. The football match. The legendary, organized game, the famous 3-2 score to the Germans. Romantic reality or a beautiful myth?
It's mostly a beautiful myth, but it's a myth that is absolutely rooted in forensic reality.
What do you mean by that?
The idea of a full, organized 11-a-side match with a referee and a proper score, that's physically impossible in almost every sector of the front.
Why? Just the terrain?
The terrain simply wouldn't allow it. I mean, you have to picture no man's land. It was a catastrophic landscape. It was pockmarked with artillery craters covered in frozen, deep mud and crisscrossed with dense tangles of barbed wire.
Not exactly Wembley Stadium.
Trying to play a formal match there would be like trying to play on a minefield. It just couldn't happen.
So if the big international match is a myth, what actually did happen?
We have crucial primary source evidence from soldiers like Ernie Williams of the 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 Regiment. He confirms that in their sector, a proper football appeared.
So there was a real ball.
There was, but he's very clear about what happened next. He said it was a kickabout, not a team game.
A chaotic, joyous scramble.
Exactly. He described maybe a couple of hundred men taking part in this chaotic melee, just running after the ball, slipping in the mud, trying to score goals that were marked by helmets or coats. It was just shared, spontaneous play.
And what about in places where they didn't have a football?
They improvised.
Yeah.
There are accounts of them using tin cans or empty ration boxes or even sandbags filled with straw and wrapped in string.
So the key takeaway is that the fact of shared play is true.
The fact of shared play, of men forgetting their roles to engage in communal sport in the death zone, that is undeniably true. And that's the reality that's commemorated by memorials, like the UEFA one in Messines. The specific score is just the romanticization that helps the story stick.
Now, it's really important that we don't just paint the truce as this festive, happy moment. The sources are clear that it was driven just as much by grim necessity as by sentiment.
The practical core of the truce, in many places, was the unburied dead.
For weeks leading up to this, the fighting had been so intense that recovering bodies from no man's land was impossible.
So no man's land was quite literally saturated with corpses.
And we have to acknowledge the sensory horror of that.
The accounts are just visceral. Soldiers talk about the constant, overwhelming stench. One described it as like 3-day-old roadkill multiplied by the thousands.
It must have been a source of constant psychological and physical distress.
And the sight of decomposing bodies, some of them caught on the barbed wire for weeks. It was just this relentless reminder of their own mortality. Clearing the battlefield was a crucial, pragmatic driver for the truce.
So on Christmas Day, the truce becomes a joint operation focused on mourning.
Precisely. You have burial parties from both sides working in parallel. And crucially, they were burying their own dead, but they were doing it side by side, often in joint ceremonies.
There are official records of this.
Yes. The war diary, the 6th Gordon Highlanders, records their padre talking with German soldiers as they recovered and prepared the bodies for burial.
That shared moment of funerary rite is maybe the most profound evidence of their shared humanity.
It absolutely is. To stop fighting to honor the dead alongside the very men who had just killed them, it transforms the battlefield.
For a few hours, they turned the kill zone into hallowed ground.
A shared cemetery, before returning to the job of killing each other.
Now, we also need to address the variations. This wasn't a universal event along the whole 475-mile front.
No, not at all. It was very geographically concentrated. The most widespread and famous truces happened along what we call the Anglo-German nexus.
About 2/3 of the British line participated to some degree.
That's the estimate, yes. And this was fundamentally facilitated by that cultural proximity we talked about and the specific Saxon factor.
Let's dig into that a little more. Why did the British distinguish Saxons from Prussians, and how would they even know the difference?
It's rooted in the structure of the German Empire. Germany was unified, but it kept these very strong regional identities. The Kingdom of Saxony was culturally distinct, and historically it was seen as less dominated by the aggressive military fervor of the Prussian Junkers.
So the British soldiers in the trenches could actually identify this difference.
Often, yes, through subtle differences in regimental badges on the uniforms, but more importantly, through dialect.
Through their accents.
British soldiers quickly learned to differentiate the accents of the men opposite them. If the Germans spoke in a less booming, less aggressive tone, they were often pegged as respectable Saxons.
Captain Hulse's quote about facing friendly Saxons.
Exactly. It reflects this diplomatic fluidity where the specific enemy opposite you was deemed acceptable for conversation in a way a Prussian regiment might not have been.
This helps explain why the truce was almost non-existent in the French and Belgian sectors.
For the French and the Belgians, this wasn't some strategic game of attrition. It was a war of liberation.
The Germans were physically occupying their soil.
They were on their home ground, and that raises a profound psychological and emotional barrier. Shaking hands with the invader, the man occupying your hometown, is a fundamentally different act.
But there were some truces in those sectors, but they were more transactional.
Yes, driven by desperation. There was a notable Belgian truce in the Yser sector that wasn't about carols or gifts. It was arranged for a very practical purpose, smuggling letters.
To families trapped behind German lines.
Exactly. It was a truce born of sheer desperation, not shared holiday spirit.
And finally, what about the colonial troops fighting for the Allies, the Indian or Algerian units?
The truce was overwhelmingly a European and Christian phenomenon. The cultural resonance of Christmas just wasn't there for Muslim or Hindu troops.
And there was also a racialized barrier.
A severe one. German propaganda often depicted colonial troops as savages, which created an immediate barrier to interaction.
So they didn't fraternize.
No, but they benefited immensely. They got a day of peace by default. For 24 hours, they could enjoy the silence, the end of artillery fire, and they could do necessary trench maintenance without fear. Their truce was logistical, not cultural.
So when the news of this widespread fraternization finally reaches the headquarters, the chateau far behind the lines, the reaction must have been one of just absolute panic.
Oh, it was catastrophic fury. For the generals, this wasn't some beautiful human moment. This was a complete collapse of military discipline and a direct threat to the entire war effort.
General Sir John French, the commander of the BAF, saw this as a mortal danger.
He did.
What was the core fear? What terrified high command so much?
It was an existential fear, the dissolution of the offensive spirit.
The will to fight?
The will to kill. War is predicated on the psychological ability of a commander to order his men to climb out of a trench and advance across open ground into machine gun fire.
And that can only happen if the soldier sees the enemy as an abstract subhuman monster.
Exactly. If the soldier realizes the man in the other trench is just a fellow sufferer who sings the same carols, that motivation collapses.
The moral calculus shifts. They might refuse to charge.
The offensive spirit needed to keep the machine of attrition running for 4 more years would simply evaporate.
So the response had to be swift and absolute.
It was. Initially, many of the officers on the line who had sort of facilitated the truce were quietly disciplined, censured, transferred to other sectors.
But then the formal orders came down.
By January 7th, 1915, official general orders were issued from GHQ forbidding all fraternization, past, present, and future.
And the warning that came with that order was chilling.
It stated explicitly that any future infraction, any soldier caught trying to fraternize, or even just failing to shoot an enemy who is trying to, would be punished as treason.
That's a threat of execution.
It is. The state had to brutally reassert that its political definition of enemy superseded the soldier's own human experience.
So how did they go back to fighting? This uneven return to killing?
In the sectors where officers had managed the peace, the end was often marked by this grim, symbolic closure. Captain Stockwell described it.
The salute?
He and his German counterpart shook hands one last time, they saluted, and then each man fired 2 shots into the air. A prearranged signal.
The truce is over.
The killing has resumed.
But in other places, the violence was immediate and tragic.
Absolutely. We have to remember the truce didn't hold everywhere. Private William Bannister of the Coldstream Guards was killed by a sniper on Christmas Day itself. The peace was always localized and precarious.
Did High Command's crackdown completely get rid of the live and let live system?
It eradicated the open mass fraternization that never happened again on that scale. The soldiers were successfully terrified back into obedience.
But the tacit system persisted.
It persisted covertly in the quiet sectors for much of the war. but it became highly disciplined. No more meeting in the middle, no more singing.
And the final nails in the coffin for any future truce.
That carried in 1915. First, the introduction of poison gas, a terrifying, indiscriminate weapon. And then the escalating, soul-crushing slaughter of battles like the Somme in 1916. Those events deepened the hatred and broadened the psychological gulf, ensuring the soldiers would never again seek common ground. #outro.
So when we synthesize this entire deep dive, the strategic failure, the intimate geography, the rational choice for survival, the cultural dialogue, and then the violent suppression, it's clear the Christmas truce was not just a feel-good holiday story.
No. It was, as we said at the start, a temporary secession from the war. It wasn't a political mutiny. It was a profoundly human, temporary abandonment of strategy, driven by the collapse of geographical distance and the shared desperate misery of the front line.
And the event is just this spectacular, if brief, demonstration that the state of being an enemy is a constructed designation.
Yes, and it requires constant maintenance through propaganda, through physical distance, and through the threat of severe military punishment.
And when that distance collapsed, when the sight of a respectable Saxon sharing tobacco directly contradicted the propaganda of the bloodthirsty Hun.
The entire psychological structure of the war just briefly, miraculously dissolved.
So the legacy of the truce is incredibly complex, isn't it? It's a testament to human resilience and connection,
But it's also a powerful indictment of the immense power of the military state.
which successfully intervened, crushed that solidarity, and reset the machine of war.
And kept it running for 4 more agonizing years. It's one of the most powerful, bittersweet stories of the 20th century, and it was a living memory for so long, right up until the death of Alfred Anderson, the last surviving witness, in 2005.
You know, if we take everything we've covered, it leads me to a final thought. Since the truce was essentially a rational, survivalist response to the stasis and shared miserable intimacy of that 1914 front line, what other conflicts today might be prevented or at least mitigated if the combatants were somehow forced into that same geographical intimacy?
That is a profoundly challenging thought, isn't it? So much of today's combat is waged through technological abstraction. Drones, screens, bombs dropped from thousands of feet in the air.
There's no intimacy.
There's no intimacy. When the human being on the other side is just a thermal signature on a screen, completely divorced from smell and sound and a shared environment, the rational basis for seeking a truce, it completely disappears.
The deep dive is complete. We'll see you next time.